Hi, I'm Ankhra. I'm the founder and president of PS314, and you are now in one of our Fireside Chats. We have decided to launch a summer series of conversations around identity, and today our discussion centers around transgender identity, love, and politics. I'm so honored to be joined by two amazing individuals. Our first guest is Imara Jones, activist, economist, producer, amazing being all around, always teaching me, and I'm learning constantly whenever you and I are talking just about humanity, quite frankly. So I'm so happy you're here. Hi, Mara.
Hi, thank you for having me.
You look lovely. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. We both have braids on.
You told me I should have braids, so I listened to you. I put them in.
They look fantastic. Don't you like them?
I love braids. I mean, it's also summertime, right? So I'm just happy to be like free of the extra thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
So Gracie Cartier is going to join us in a little bit. But first, I thought I can just introduce what the conversation is about. I feel that we're just in this really interesting time where maybe we're breaking out of our own silos of reality and trying to understand everyone else's reality. I think that's a part of our culture in America, that we tend to just live through whatever our unique experiences are. And I think the drawback in that is that oftentimes we forget about the humanity of someone else's experience. So, the goal really is just to have a conversation. I know that you have an amazing platform where you have elevated your voice and that of the trans community. And so I wanted to just share that voice, as I think, just to kind of knock out any other echo chambers that we might be in, and invite you to share a bit more about your journey. So that's our conversation today. I'm just going to begin. I think that it would be really wonderful, Imara, if you can just introduce yourself and how do you define who are you?
I define myself as a person who uses stories to shift how people see the world. That's mainly how I do that. And I define the way in which I do that primarily is through the lens of journalism. So I'm a journalist, and I'm a founder and a creator. Those are the words that I attach to myself. And the reason why I think journalism is really important is because it is grounded in skepticism. It is grounded in facts. It is grounded in finding actual people and finding out what's really going on. And so therefore, for me, that's an important part of who I am and what I do. And even when I have opinions about things or advance a certain point of view, I always do it through those means. And with those kind of grounding principles. So that's fundamentally how I describe myself.
Well, I want to go back because I want just to kind of introduce you to the world, right? So I think that it would be great to hear about your transition story. Can you talk a little bit about the journey to Imara?
Right, to Imara now.
To Imara now, yeah. How do we get here?
Yeah, so I think that my journey has been one in which there have been so many phases, right? Like if we go back in time in terms of how I identified as, well, now I'm trans, and I've always been trans. And it's been a journey of excavation to get to the point where I could actually embrace who I was. I call what I have done in my life is peeling back the ideas of who I was supposed to be and who I thought I could be to try to get more and more and more to who I am. And I think that that's the only thing that we can expect in life, hopefully, is to end up more of ourselves and understanding ourselves than when we started. And so I've gone through lots of different phases. So I grew up assigned male at birth, grew up as a Black boy on the exterior in the South, in Atlanta. My whole family is from the South, very, very deep Southern roots. And it was always strange for me at a certain point because I realized that people were interacting with me as a boy, even though inside I knew that I was a girl. And that's a very strange way to grow up, where people are interfacing with the perception of who you are, which frames a certain reality versus your own reality. And so what that meant is that over time, you become schooled in how to meet others' expectations. You become schooled in feeling that there is a limitation or limitations to what you can do and how you can be and how people will hear you. And so over time, there grew to be more and more and more a gap between who I was and how I was moving in the world, imposed by these very severe limitations. And so consequently, over time, I literally have spent a large part of my life moving out of that, right? So first identifying as like straight, I guess, and then being, well, I'm bi, then being like, no, I'm gay, then being like, no, I'm gender non-conforming, non-binary, and then being like, oh shit, no, I'm actually trans, right? And so it's been these like stages of pulling back, all these different layers to get to who I was, so that this gap between how I was in the world and how I was allowed to be and how I was showing up and who I actually was inside closed, and closed.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, because I heard you clearly when you said gap, and then the closure. Is that about when you say just like the various transitions of identity? Did that come with the relationship to other people, or was that about self-work, or was that both?
It's everything. It's a combination of me leaving home. That was a huge part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like I had to leave home, but I was very strategic. I was like, I'm not going to just leave home without a plan. So that's kind of my whole, I block and tackle a lot. So like that for me was like, okay, well, I'm not going to leave without a plan. So my plan was to go to college, and I was going to go to college a long way from home because I culturally needed to leave the South. I needed to leave a Southern paradigm of life.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I got to New York, so I came to Columbia, then being exposed to other different types of people, being in this place where you are presented with a panoply of possibility and what it can be, then opened my mind to what I could possibly be, that there actually could be space for me in this world. And then I met people in my life who were also different. And so and then I did work. So it's all of those things swirling together. Who we are is the result of a lot of different forces, which is what I was, trying to explain about growing up and then peeling back all these layers over time. And so, as we have more space to be more of ourselves, and as we create more space to be ourselves, then that space can actually be filled with our actualized self.
What do you think about, there's this whole controversy right now about who's allowed to transition and at what period of time in their lives. And I think a lot of the discussion has a lot to do with children who have identified very specifically. I know that we've had a couple of different examples, but I just think about like Dwayne Wade's daughter who's kind of transitioned. So what is that? Do you have any specific feelings about when someone should be allowed to, or is that about?
If I had been allowed to transition at 7, it would have been incredible for my life. And there would have been no difference in decision between 7 and like all the time since then. It would have been incredible. And if I had lived in a world where that was possible, and all they're going to do by denying people the ability to transition early is increase suicide rates, increase depression, increase tremendous pain and hardship, because children don't arrive at their identities like lightly, like, and every single person who has experienced children at various different ages, realizing that the way that they're being raised isn't who they actually are, that doesn't go away. So I think, if I had been able to transition at 7, it would have been incredible.
That's so interesting. I mean, obviously it's politics, it's family, culture as well. You mean you just spoke to, it was time when I was able to leave that made a huge difference. Living and identifying as a Black man first, and then transitioning to a Black woman over a period of time, has that changed any of your politics because of your identity in terms of like the body that you're moving in the world from male to female?
No, I think a couple of things. I think that like I never was that in the first place. That's how So I never was that, and then I became something else. I always was that. It was this veneer, this facade, this virtual reality imposed over the person, imposed over the girl, imposed over the young woman. Like that's what was happening. So honestly, my politics, for a while when I was, in my teenage years and dumb, I just started like misogyny, because that's just honestly a part of affirming masculinity is misogyny. So that I just did that, just to like, that's because that's what you were supposed to do as a boy. You know what I mean? You're supposed to be dumb. But I think, probably by the time I was 19, I was like, I didn't have any, my politics were pretty progressive and left. I believe and have always believed in the equal rights of women. In so many ways, there were experiences and thoughts that I had where I was acculturated as a woman anyway. And what do I mean by that? I mean by that is, as I tell people all the time, like, whatever gender you actually are, no matter how you raised, those are the gender lessons that you learned. So I still, in myself, grew up as a Black woman and a Black girl, even though that wasn't the way that the world was interfacing with me, right? And so consequently, when those things were able to find expression, the full range of my beliefs about masculinity and femininity and the ability of people to be, the need for full equality and all of that, was just able to find even more expression, I guess, is what I'm saying. But I had I had done politics when I was a teenager, but not past probably 19.
When you are finally able to embody as your true self, right, and Imara is present, are people, what is that experience like? Because obviously what I'm hearing from you very clearly is Imara's always been here. It's really how the world saw you over a period of time that you were kind of dealing with. So did the world deal with you differently as a Black man versus now showing up in the world as a Black woman?
First of all, like living as a Black man was a really, I guess it was, but again, like I lived this, like I lived that, in terms of like, but from the time that I left home was a very short period of time, right? It wasn't like half my life or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think that's one thing. I think that, no, I had hard because like for a long time, probably the longest part of my stretch was like living as gender non-conforming, like gay femme and then gender non-conforming, right, is the way that I would describe it. And that was hard. That was always hard because I always stood out. I always, people would always talk about me. And then I had like crazy stuff happen to me that happened to women. Like I had stalkers, I had people follow me home. I had like, all these things, because if you're a femme identified person, even if you're deemed masculine, there's this different way in which the world treats you. And it is far more aggressive and intense and scrutinizing. And so I had that for a long time. And so I didn't really feel, and honestly, like as a woman, I had that so much less, to be honest. It's actually easier for me to navigate. And it is because this is who I actually am, right? It's so much easier for me to navigate the world. Now than then. There's some crazy things, like a big difference is the way in which people hear you.
Tell me more about that.
Well, what's fascinating is that you'll be in a meeting, right? And someone will ask a question, and then, all of the men will basically talk about themselves and give the first answers for like 15 minutes, and they won't even notice that you haven't said anything. And so I just generally, my tactic is I let that process play out. and I let them take up a lot of space, and then I weigh in, and then I say what I say. But that's interesting, just the way that people hear you, whether or not how they listen to you. That is a huge part of gender that I've noticed. But in so many other ways, things have gotten easier for me. Yeah.
Can we talk about love?
Yes, we can talk about love.
What's your first love story?
Well, one of my stories, romantic stories, is actually this guy who is cis-identified and Black, who I started having like a secret 4-year
Wow.
relationship with in high school. Yeah, probably that one.
And what's the future for you? Your future love story, what does that look like?
My future love story is probably one that is grounded in gender binariness, or I'm sorry, gender non-binariness and gender non-conformity. Because one of the things that I've realized, this is a whole nother topic for conversation, but one of the things that I've realized is that honestly, as I become more secure in my womanhood, the less I need to have a relationship with a certain type of man, or even like cis men. For me, I realize that masculinity is broader, and what I'm actually attracted to is masculinity, and that can show up in lots of different types of bodies and lots of different types of people.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's actually what I'm attracted to, not necessarily cis men. And the more that I have become grounded in my own womanhood, the less I actually feel like I need the affirmation, the gaze, the certification of my womanhood through a cis male gaze.
So it's interesting, because I want to talk about family and kind of how you define family now. Is it different than how you defined it when you were younger? I've heard various stories of having to leave behind a very traditional family during transition. So are you still connected to your family?
Yeah, and it's split, excuse me. Well, it's essentially my dad and everybody else. It's kind of like, so my dad's in one corner, and then everybody else, even my dad's sisters, are like not in that category.
Okay.
So overwhelmingly, have been embraced by my family, and especially the women of my family embraced me. And I mean, from the ages of like 90 to 15. I'm embraced overwhelmingly by my family, but overwhelmingly by the women of my family. Those are the places where I have those types of relationships. And so for me, my definition of family is broad. It is like the people that you have commitment to, right? It's not only about history, but it's also about commitment. And those can be blood family ties, which I think are extremely important. But then also, within the history of our traditions, within the history of African traditions around the world, kinship ties are also important. So those are people that are like family, but not blood family. Kinship ties are really important. So I think I have a kinship model for family, which is this odd combination of blood ties and not blood ties, but people who you define as family.
And how do you define beauty? Are your standards of beauty aligned with the world, or is it Imara's standards of beauty? You and I have had conversations about what it means to live in a world that's dominated by patriarchy and misogyny. So who's defining beauty for you?
Me.
I figured, but what does that mean? What is beauty to you?
It's so many. I mean, I think for me, beauty for me is actually rooted in Blackness. I think I have a Black centered, not exclusive, right? So to underscore, it's a Black centered view of beauty in which there are a wide range of beauty possibilities. Like beauty can be thick, it can be small. And so I think that like so many things, it's like richness, it's the power and the beauty of my beauty standards are Black beauty standards. And it's about a depth of color, it's about a depth and power in bodies, it's about really strong facial features. Like all of these things are really beautiful to me. And they define my sense of beauty. I don't have normal beauty standards at all. And a lot of things that other people think are hot, I don't think they don't do it for me.
I wonder if it's simply, I shouldn't say simply, but I think so much of our experiences then impact the way that we see the world. And so just kind of, it feels to me that over time, you've knocked down so many of like the barriers of identity around yourself and not allowing other people to define you, quite frankly, to really just like fight for your own existence and your placement in the world. If that also then doesn't allow for any other standards of beauty to impact you. It's like,
That's
other standards don't impact because I've created this space for myself.
right. And I think that if I were trying to still be somebody that I wasn't, or practically being someone that I wasn't, then I would be very concerned about what other people thought about how I looked. And I would be very concerned about how people thought my partner looked or who I found to be beautiful. So yeah, I think the more you let go of that, like the more you can see the people that really do that. And I think that because I grew up in Atlanta and I grew up in a Black-centered world, and that was and Black was very positive for me growing up. Like I had a very positive association with Blackness and still do, like very much so. Like Blackness is really beautiful to me, and like the range of Blackness is really powerful and really striking and alluring to me.
So you've had your own personal experience, right? But what does it mean? I mean, I'm just curious to know, when was the first time you saw representation of trans on the screen, and who was it?
Well, there are tons of representations of drag on the screen, right?
Mm.
I think that was actually a part of my confusion. Oof, I just said it and got angry. I think that was a part of my confusion because in so many ways, men doing drag and Black men doing drag, like Wesley Snipes in that movie.
Oh, Tu Wong Fu.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Like that made me think, I associated that with trans, and that made me be like, well, that's not me. And that's weird, right? Because it's a caricature. It's men assuming that being a woman just means putting on different fucking clothes and makeup. It is, these extreme, and it's also at the same time making fun of people who are actually trans or gender nonconforming or non-binary. And so all of those things made me think that like that was transness when that's not transness. I think the first person that I identified who as trans, who like took my breath away when I first saw them was actually RuPaul, which Ru doesn't identify as trans, identifies as a drag queen and as a gay man. But when I saw Ru and what they were and how powerful they were, that I was like, oh, that's a thing. And so probably that, to be honest, and that really began to shift my idea about like about transformation and how transformation would be possible. Mm-hmm. So I really think that it was probably RuPaul, even though RuPaul doesn't identify as trans.
And it's interesting because you talked about powerful and you talked about presence and then the connection with the Black women in your family. And I think you even used some of the same words. So just kind of an interesting space there. You're an amazing activist and you have Translash. Can you talk a little bit about what Translash is and why you created it?
Yeah, and just to say that, like, it's really interesting to me, but like when people ask, like, what are your role models are, I immediately think of all of the women in my family. Like they are, and all the Black women that I knew growing up, and they are all my role model more than the world. So I always have to like pull, because if I say all these random names, no one's gonna know. So I always have to like, say people who I think are like that, like Tina Turner and like all these other people.
Yeah.
So in any event, like, I just wanted to move on that, but I wanted to honor that because they very much define my idea of Blackness and Black womanhood. That I'm so grateful for.
Well, okay, let's stay with that for a second. So without it, right, without having them as because we're just thinking about what was the representation that was on the screen or even in magazines for you, if you didn't have these powerful, amazing, beautiful Black women in your family as role models as support to you as a human being, what does that world look like? And I'm thinking not only for Imara, but just like the importance of family and community and presence.
I'd be totally lost. I would be lost. I would be lost as a Black woman. I would be lost. I mean, truly lost. Like I would not have any sense of grounding. I would be trying to respond to all these like outside beauty images of me and how I could live up to certain things. I would always be feeling insecure. I would always be feeling not beautiful. I would always be feeling like I didn't have agency. I would always be feeling like, I had to have some type of like, man in my life to ground me. Like I would be lost, truly lost without them and without that. I mean, that would be terrible. That would be absolutely terrible.
So is that one of the reasons? Is there a line of connection to why you created Trans Lash? Because I really want to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, why I created Trans. Yeah, I mean, I created Trans Lash because I wanted to show trans people as people. It's real simple. I wanted to give representation, one that I never had, but also representation to people who exist now, right? So that there is this incredible richness and diversity, and that people, despite the odds, are living their lives and contributing and have really important and powerful things to say about our community and our world and should be listened to. And so I wanted to do that. And my main reason for thinking that or wanting to create that is because of the tremendous amount of death and the epidemic of violence against Black trans women that is on a global scale. Here in the United States, we have a global problem of violence against trans women that is the worst in the world, except for two countries, Brazil and Mexico. And, just in the last 2 weeks, I think we've lost 8 Black trans women, which is insane given our percentage of the population. Like they're less than 500,000 of us in the whole country. And so, I think that that's why I created Trans Lash, because my belief is that as we can center the humanity of trans people, it decreases hostility against us and makes it more likely that people won't kill us.
Okay, but you've told me about the mortality rate and the life expectancy, and I want to say is it 35 for Black trans women?
Yes, yeah, it's a little different than it's portrayed. The life expectancy isn't 35. It's a technical point, but it is true that if a Black trans woman is killed before the age of 35, it's because she was. If a Black trans woman dies before the age of 35, it's because she was murdered.
It's because she was murdered.
Yeah.
And so who is she? So do we know?
Yes.
Who that villain is? That who's
yes.
the villain?
So let me just go back and say, and so like what I say all the time, and this links to what I said in the beginning, is that like I tell trans stories to save trans lives. Like that's essentially what Trans Lash is about in one sentence. They're Black men. They are Black men. And they are Black men overwhelmingly with whom these women have had relationships. And I think this is a really important point because of this massive intimate partner violence against Black trans women, meaning that it is Black trans women are killed by people who know them. That's who kills Black trans women, not strangers. And it's really important because it tracks very much with the way that the violence that Black women overall, Black cis women face, because Black women have the highest incidence of intimate partner violence than any other group of women in this country, including Native women, Black women too. And so there's a strong parallel between why and how Black women, both cis and trans, die. And we actually have a common need to address that commonly. Right. It's interesting because some Black women people think that like Black cis women, Black trans women aren't real women and all the rest of it. But we die in the same way, and we die in the same way because we are deemed to be women, period. And so, we need to address that.
That's interesting because we're having this very broad conversation in our country around Black people dying at the hands of police. And the solutions that are coming up: defund the police, de-escalate, demilitarize, etc. What are some of the solutions to this crisis that you're speaking of?
Yeah, I think a couple of them. I think one, I mean, also like we could get into it, but there are ways in which Black trans people are disproportionately over policed and have terrible interactions with the police, face tremendous violence, not only, on the street and also once in behind bars. And almost every Black trans organization across the country has decarceration or defunding the police as their number one or number two priorities, right? So I want to underscore that, that intersection is very real for Black trans people. But what can we do? Some of the things that we can do to decrease the violence against Black trans women. Black trans women need more important, stable sources of income and employment, to be less reliant upon partners, right, and dependent upon partners. Secondly, the murder of Black trans women needs to be taken seriously by authorities and needs to be taken seriously by people overall, right? Because, one of the perpetrators last year of a Black trans woman in Missouri, he shot her in the front yard and then just calmly waited next to her body for the police to show up. Like, he didn't even think that he'd done anything wrong. And that's because society tells him that our lives don't matter. So it's thirdly changing this wider framework in the Black communities to talk about Black trans murders. I mean, if Black trans women can be members of AKA and Delta, which they can be because those two sororities allow trans women to be members, why haven't either of those organizations ever spoken out about Black trans death? Why hasn't the National Council of Negro Women said anything about Black trans death? Why hasn't the NAACP? Why don't we have these broader conversations so that there can be this cultural shift in the Black community? So I think it is changing and improving the economic situation and housing situation of Black trans women. It's about authorities taking our deaths seriously, prosecuting people understanding that this is a crime and will be dealt with as such. And then thirdly, this big cultural shift that we need to have in the Black community around these murders and speaking out. No, Black women's organizations do not speak out about the murders of Black trans women.
So it sounds like you're really making a case around the solidarity between Black cis women and Black trans women and a need to kind of bring ourselves together and fight for liberation. Is that accurate?
It's 100% accurate. And I think it's one of the, points that is echoed by other people that I admire, like Dr. Angela Davis, right? Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who came up with the idea of intersectionality. They're both massive proponents of Black cis and trans women working together to get free and to end patriarchy. Because the division of women is a tool of patriarchy, right? And so we have to end that if we want to be free.
I'm curious to know, I was recently reading a bit about gay liberation, and there was a quote, and I'm not going to say it verbatim, but basically the conversation was when white gay men and women were able to get marital rights, to be able to marry, they were no longer there for the fight for liberation for Black, gay, and lesbian people. Is that true? Do you feel that is there a disconnect between within the LGBTQ community as it relates to race and culture?
100%. I mean, I think that it's even broader than that. I think that specifically wealthy white gays just walked away from the gay movement overall. Like, I mean, they declared mission accomplished when right now you can still, well, not due to the Supreme Court ruling, but up until 2 weeks ago, you could be fired from your job for just being gay or trans. So if that was the case in 27 states, 30 states if you were trans, but 27 states, why would you ever conclude that just because you got married that the job was done?
Right.
Right. That's because you are at a case where it doesn't matter that if you're harassed by police, you don't get harassed by police. You don't get discriminated against housing. You don't get discriminated against jobs, all of the rest of it. And so I think that they walked away from the gay movement overall. And, as a part of that, trans people suffered. But I even think that it's even more pernicious than we talked about, which is that, what happened is that Black and trans women of color, people who are non-binary, people who are identified as drag, were essential in creating the movement for gay liberation, specifically at Stonewall. But they were deliberately pushed out of the movement that they created by white gays and lesbians, but more white gays in 1973. So Stonewall happened in 1969. 4 years later, they were deliberately pushed out of the movement because white gays thought, we're not going to be able to get our freedom if people identify gays and our entire community with people who are Black or trans or gender nonconforming. So the people that started the movement have not benefited from the movement that they created. Mm-hmm. And that essentially is a part of the unfinished business that we're still living with.
So that's one of my questions. What does liberation look like at this moment? If you speak a little bit about LGBTQ community and that movement, and then we've just spoken a little bit about what I assume we're alluding to as Black Lives Matter in general, right? That we all have to be included. But what is liberation meant to look like as far as you're concerned?
Liberation is where we are free from both the cultural constraints of the impositions about who we are, as well as the structural and institutional structures that amplify those that lead to oppression, right? So for example, the reason why so many women have to fight to still get into certain jobs is because we have a cultural idea that women only can do certain things because of biology, right? And so we're still having women first all the time. Like just right now, regardless of what you think of the military, the first Black woman fighter pilot in the Marines was last week. This is 2020. Right. So why is that such a big deal? Because people for a long time said, well, the women can't do those jobs and Black women can't do those jobs. So liberation is where we're free from all that, and liberation works for men as well, where they get to be whatever they need to be in order to be happy. A friend of mine told me, for instance, that she's married, they have 2 kids. And for the longest time, they both worked, and her husband felt like because he was a man that he needed to go to work every day and basically play a role. And then they got to a point in their marriage where nobody was happy, whatever. And so finally they worked out that the thing that made her happy was to go to work and he stayed home. Yeah. And ever since that's happened, she's like, our marriage is better than it's ever been because he's actually able to be who he really wants to be. And I can be who I really need to be. And our kids are happy too, because they see us fulfilling that. We're not constrained by the imposition of these ideas of who we're supposed to be. Mm-hmm. And we need that across the board. We need that across the board. We don't have that. And we need that in institutions, and we need that in our lives, and we need that in our relationships. And that's what liberation looks like. So
we have to make space for it at this point.
We have to make space for it, and we have to make space for other people. All the time, people ask me what I can, people say, well, what can I do? Mm-hmm. And I say, you shift power to other people. It's real simple.
Why? Why is that the solution, to shift power to other people?
Because that's how people get marginalized, is because they're disempowered, right? So for instance, why don't Black people own property in this country? It's because since the beginning, there's been a systematic attempt to deny Black people a property, even when Black people have property. One of the ways in which we got the Great Migration is because there was a massive campaign on the Klan, in the turn of the 19th century, to terrorize Black people, to get them to leave their land so that they could take it. And that moved millions of people off of land that they had from the South to the North. That's how we got the Great Migration, right? So even when Black people have owned stuff in this country, people take it away.
Because we're not in power at the same time as having.
We don't have power, right? So that the solution to the Klan coming and take your property, or if someone tried to take your property by force, you call the police. Well, Black people couldn't call the police, right? That's not the answer. And the national government had decided that prioritizing the reintegration of the South in the country after Reconstruction in the early part of the century was a higher priority than Black people holding on to the shit that they had scraped out barely after the Civil War. So it is about shifting power. We need shifts in power. We need shifts in money. We need big shifts in order to create space for other people. And a really great example of this, I wish I could remember his name. No, his first name is Alex, but Serena Williams' husband, who
Oh, right. He moved off of the board, right? Of the
No,
company he started.
As like president or whatever of Reddit.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, during Black Lives last month, he was like, I realized that like I've made all my money. I'm still gonna own this company. Why do I have to be in this job? Like, let me give this job to a Black man. Like, let me get out of the way and create space for somebody else, because it's not going to materially impact me, but it is really important for our broader society. So he resigned, and they hired a Black man.
And so is that the question? And I think Darren Walker speaks to this at Ford Foundation, and he says, when you are in a position of privilege, the question you have to ask yourself is, what sacrifice am I willing to make of my privilege? Is that it? Are we all meant to, whoever is seated in a position of power or privilege, to ask yourself to make a sacrifice to ensure that another voice that has been marginalized now takes that seat?
Yeah, I would phrase it differently, although like I don't have Darren's job, so he knows a lot more than I do. But I would phrase it slightly differently. I would say, what can I do to create space for other people, knowing that whatever I do might make me slightly uncomfortable, right? Like, what are you willing to do that's uncomfortable to create space for other people? That's the question. It's not, I don't think it's a sacrifice. It wasn't really a sacrifice for him to give up his job. He's rich. He still is going to own a huge part of the company. And his wife is rich. It wasn't that big of a deal, but it meant something in terms of symbol and status and self-worth. And so he gave it up. Mm-hmm. So the sacrifices that we're actually asking people to make aren't real sacrifices, right? They are about creating space for other people. But because of the way that whiteness works, those things feel like sacrifices. Those things feel like insults. They feel like attacks. But they're not actually attacks. We're actually asking them to create more space for other people. And that means them doing that. They create more space for white people all the time.
So let's make more. So is that the question, though, that we should all ask? Because we've touched on so many different communities,
Yes.
right? We've talked about white gay men and women. We've talked about Black cis women. We've talked about Black cis men. Everyone should be asking themselves that question.
I think that's right, but it's if you are in a position of power and authority, and that can be small or it can be large, right? So I think that that's really important. There is something that we can all do, but because of their disproportionate money and power, it really is centered on the decision makers in this country to create this space. But I think it is up to all of us. But I know friends and companies who are literally fighting to create more space for people of color, fighting to create more space for trans people, fighting to change the way in which they do bathrooms, change the way in which they, structure holidays and talk about different things inside their company, right? That's where the shift needs to happen. And it's organizations. People ask me all the time, well, what can my organization do? I was like, hire trans people, hire Black people, hire them, promote them, retain them, and then create the culture where they can thrive, right? Like that's what you're one, it's within your writ. That's what you can do. Most people want to have it be sort of an isolated volunteer opportunity where they can I can help this nonprofit or do this thing. No, hire somebody.
Yeah.
Retain them, promote them, create a culture where they feel safe.
Let me ask you the question, though, because I think that there are very specific points that you made as it relates to, we had the conversation around what it means with defunding police. We've talked about Black cis men, we've talked about Black cis women and the organizations, but in terms of community and culture, and again, you're inside of an echo chamber. What is your advice to individuals who are talking to people that they love, who just don't understand gender identity? What is it that's going to be helpful for them to really quite get it outside of walking in your shoes?
Not everybody is gettable, so we have to make a distinction between people who are gettable and who are not. The second thing is that it can take people a while, but we have to allow them to surprise us. So they may not hear you the first time. They may not hear you the second time. They may not hear you the third time. But something about the fourth time, they get it. And there will be that initial resistance. And then they'll hear about it and it'll turn around in their head and then they'll start paying more attention. And so like, I think that it can be a process of acceptance and change, which we have to allow for it. It may not necessarily be immediate. So I don't think that the conversations are wasteful, right? I don't think that they are futile.
Mm-hmm.
And it is important, it is incumbent upon us to have them. I also think that, at some point as well, it also is worth thinking of what their resistance is possibly indicative of them, right? Are they the person that you thought they were? How do they view their own humanity, right? So it can raise these other questions. So I think that these conversations are important. They may not take the first time. Over time, people can change and surprise us.
Mm.
But there will be certain people who are outside of that. And I think it then raises larger questions about them and then your relationship with them. And so that's what I would say about that. And keep having the conversations. You shouldn't stop. And so then specifically, what do you say to them? The problem is, right, that everything that everybody learns about gender is wrong. So what you're actually battling against is orthodoxy. You're not actually battling against something that is provable, because science says that the way that we've divided men from women is totally specious, right? It is not work. And so consequently, it's actually about people scaling back ignorance. And that's hard. Can we go back for a minute? I'm wondering, what do those people say, though, if you're having those conversations? Like, what is the what's the main line of resistance that you've heard or other people relay to you about the resistance to people, accepting trans people as people?
So this is one of the reasons I wanted to have the conversation with you. And I think when we first started to talk a little bit about it, I wanted to have a conversation with one one black cis woman and one black transgender woman, right? Because who were one living the experience and one not understanding it. And I really wanted to create connection, because I have been in those rooms, just as I've been in South Africa, and not today because I have a really beautiful tan, but in the winter I get a little pale. And I happen to be in South Africa. And when I arrived, because of their caste system, I'm identified as colored. I'm not considered to be black. And I was in Johannesburg in a cab, and an Indian driver, and he said to me, "Be careful in this neighborhood because the blacks are really violent." And it was like being a fly on the wall. And I just leaned all the way in and asked him to explain all of that. To your point, like, explain to me what's really happening in these conversations, right? And so I've also been a part of conversations with friends and people I love who do not understand identity through the view and perspective and lived experience of a Black trans woman. And and it ranges, though, Imara, it ranges from, I do not validate that as a true existence and identity. Like, truly off of, like, it's not possible. That's actually some conversations. And then there are other conversations that are around, well, I know that there are people who are transgender, but then there's a cutoff. And that's why I asked you the question specifically about at what age, because there's so much controversy about identity for younger people. And I hear that a lot from Black cis women who are mothers, who feel that their younger children would not possibly know. Now, this is not everyone, but I think a lot of it has to do with not understanding or being close to anyone who's ever had the lived experience of being a Black trans woman.
I also think that I would also argue that those people also they don't understand themselves.
Tell me more about that.
Yeah. Because I would say, I would be really curious as to see what are the foundations of their own identity. Because I think if you see identity as fragile, then you have a very rigid, and I think that a core of resistance from Black cis women to Black trans women is because a lot of Black cis women see their own womanhood and their own femininity as really fragile. They see it as something that is not really validated, and they're fighting so hard for it to be validated because it's so real for them, but they don't see it being seen as being real in the country, in the experience and the world, right? And so therefore, for Black women who, for them, like, identity is fragile, it's narrow.
Narrowly defined.
It's narrow. Yeah. Like there's no room, there's no flexibility. And so like there's this thing that they're trying to fit in that they hope that the world will see them as, and it's just one thing. It's not a broad idea, right? And so that's what I mean is that I bet for these women, if you unpack it, I bet that they see that their own femininity, their own womanhood as a very fragile thing in this world. I bet that they have all sorts of conversations about not being seen as women, all of this stuff. And so now I'm supposed to see them as women, right? I bet if you were to peel back some of the layers, it would be that. And that's really fascinating and that's really sad because that's white supremacy having done a job on them.
I was thinking about indoctrination and what we're all living through and not even really understanding ourselves and, just having this conversation around.
Exactly.
What you don't have, this is coming back to the middle of our conversation, not having any of those boundaries to define you and your beauty and your presence because you've actually lived through the experience of knocking so much of it down. To exist today, you've needed to do that. So that doesn't even exist for you any longer where someone else can define you. But if you have never had to do that through your lived experience, that's all new information. That's right? I'm curious. I remember when Hillary and Barack were running for president, I was talking to a group of girlfriends, all Black women, and there's 7 of us. And so half were for Hillary. We need a woman in office. That's what it kind of distilled down to. And then half were for Barack. And we needed to have finally a Black person who was in office. And one friend basically said, when you leave your house, what do you identify as first, a woman or a Black person? And so I'm just curious for you, when you leave home, who are you? Like, is there one main identity that leads, or is it the intersection as Kimberly spoke to?
My identities are indivisible for me. They're indivisible. There is no prioritization. There is no separation. Every experience that I have is always through that filter.
Yeah.
So no, there's not one or the other. I don't understand.
It was the first time I ever had that type of conversation, and I always reflect upon it, especially whenever we're talking about intersectionality and our multiple identities. What is very clear to some, and what is not. During this time, self-care for you looks like what?
Trying to stay grounded, and for me, that's very much attached to my yoga/exercise practice, which I actually like working out at home. I didn't know that I was going to like that, but I kind of like it better than the gym.
Why?
I knew that. Because I can do things in my own way and in my own time. And I don't have to have a production around going to the gym. I literally can wake up, put on my workout clothes, push my furniture apart, and then choose a workout and then do that, or choose a yoga sequence to follow it and do that. And then it's done. I don't have to do this whole other thing and the thing in the gym and then the classes and so I like it more than I thought that I would. So that's been a part of my practice. And then I have a weekly phone call with, a set of Black women. Well, there's actually one gay man who's an honorary member, but Black women who are mostly queer, and we have a weekly conversation each week that grounds me, and where we get to, if we need to, find ways to support each other during the week, and so that's really important to me. So those 2 things.
I love that kind of community and just like taking care of your body. I love working out at home too. I actually quit my gym. There are a few things I plan to quit during COVID. Last question that I have for you, just association of words. So what would be the word that could describe you before your transition, in that period of time before you even moved out of Atlanta? What's the word that embodies like that experience? What is the word that describes your feeling of today? And then the word that describes your feelings for the hope of tomorrow.
Fear, freedom, and possibility.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, Imara. This has been amazing, as usual. We appreciate you so much.
Thank you so much.